Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm Keith Harris. I'm the course team leader on the MA in the Rabbinic program. That's years 4 and 5, the final 2 years of the program. I'd like to welcome you all to this, which is going to be our third Viva Day. And if previous years are anything to go by, it will be a very joyous and also stimulating occasion. I'd just like to say a few words about what this is and why we do it. Why do we do this? This is a relatively new tradition at the college, but one that draws on older traditions. Those of you who know how PhDs work, at the end of a PhD in Britain and in other countries too, you will have your thesis examined by a committee, or maybe do a public defence, and that will be your Viva. And if you pass your Viva, you pass what?
You're not on camera. You're not on camera.
Right, okay. Me on camera?
No need to start again.
I'm now on camera. That's not what's happening. That's not, and that is what the college used to do back in the day. Certainly before my time, certainly before Deborah's time, is that there would be an official examination of the dissertation. As it happens, what we've retained and what we've brought back in is some of the outward form of the Viva, but rest assured, everybody who's presenting today has passed their dissertation, and indeed has passed the final 2 years of the course, and will be ordained on Sunday, provided there is one blood-curdling proviso in the course books, which is unless they present their hardbound copies of their dissertation to the library before Sunday, they will not be ordained. So the clock is ticking on that.
Almost everybody has.
Almost. That's the point. So why do we do this? We do this because we see the dissertation as the culmination of the 5 years that students are at Rabbinic school here, and also for the MA in Jewish education that we run, and that we have one person presenting today. The dissertation is also the culmination there. The way I see the dissertation is, to use a fairly gendered, well, no, a very gendered term, it is one's masterpiece. And if people know what a masterpiece literally was, that was when a journeyman progressed to, in medieval crafts union, would proceed to being a fully qualified member of that guild through producing something that built on their skills but was also unique to them. So if you're a cabinet maker, you'd make a gorgeous cabinet, and that would show off your skills, and not just what you've already learnt, but your ability to apply what you've learnt in your own unique way. And that's what we see the dissertation, particularly on the Rabbinic program, to be. And it's also about setting the tone for the rabbinate. And I teach the preparation classes for the dissertation in the 4th and 5th year, and anyone who's been in one of the classes knows that I always talk about a word that we don't really have in Jewishness, that doesn't quite translate into a Jewish concept, but is actually very useful. The idea that Christian clergy talk about their ministry, that their ministry that is unique to them, something, a particular, if you like, a mission, a agenda that they intend to pursue throughout their careers. So we see the rabbinate as being guided by a particular sense of ministry, and one of the things that the dissertation that we encourage students to do is to use it as the opportunity to set out what that ministry is going to be, or lay the intellectual groundwork for it. And in doing so, we draw on another concept, which is what we call applied rabbinic theology. And there are three elements to this. The applied bit is we want students to be dealing with a real-world problem, a real-world issue to some degree. Not doing abstract philosophy, although we do that at other points, and it's very important Jewishly, to apply to a particular problem. Rabbinic, the second bit, we want students to show off their skills in rabbinic material broadly defined from our textual tradition that we place a lot of emphasis in teaching over the course of the program here, and theology, because theology applies a kind of systematic way of thinking through problems and issues in the religious life. Now this year, all 4 students in the rabbinic program have demonstrated, I think, really well what we intend the dissertation to be. And they've done this in part, as you'll see today, because they've been a very close and supportive year that I, for one, and I think most of the other faculty and students who are going to miss terribly in the next few months and years. They've been close. One of the ways they've demonstrated that is in the dissertation program. I offer students the opportunity to meet with me privately, to use the slots allocated in the timetable to talk to me privately, or to be in a group to talk about their dissertations collectively in front of each other, getting feedback from the other. And this year, the students have chosen the latter option. They've been there for each other. They've watched each other's work grow and develop. They've added to it. They've contributed to it. And that is something that I both admire and for, and I think we can see as a model for the work that we do at the college. One student is not going to be here today. Daniela Touati from France will be arriving for ordination tonight, so won't be able to present today, but suffice it to say her dissertation is very well worth reading if she deposits in the library in time to be here. And as I said before, we also have Avi Marco, who will be presenting his dissertation, which is on the MA in Jewish Education, which, and I'm sure Joanne would like me to publicise it, we are still actively soliciting students for. It's a great program. If you know people who are interested in it, please let Joanne or I know. So without further ado, we're going to start now, and the first person who's Charles Middleborough is going to chair the rest of the day, and we're going to start with Igor Zinkov, whose fulsome notes are on your chairs. So, Igor.
So, what does a Jew do first thing in the morning? Some people would say, read morning blessings, Birkot HaShachar, and some people would say, check social media. And probably the latter is true for most progressive Jews. And this is one of the reasons why I chose this topic. Jewish concept of ethical communication in social media. So this thesis applies Jewish ethics of communication to the online world, to the world of social media, for Jewish organizations, not for individuals. And this is important to understand from the beginning. So the main result of this work, you can see on your chairs, the handout. I would like to ask you not to read it and to follow me for the first 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll go through it together. But if you do, it's also okay. So I will speak for about 25-30 minutes, and then there will be 15 minutes for questions. And the main result is written guidelines for social engagement of a Jewish organization, for social media engagement for a Jewish organization or synagogue. So why I chose this topic? So the first reason is numbers. There are more active social media users than some of us would like to see. So there are 42% worldwide, and in the UK, the percentage is 62% of the UK population, or over 60% of the UK population are active social media users, and 53% are active internet users, and about 95% of internet users are in the UK, of the entire population. So the second one is current climate of Jewish social media might be potentially harmful for people's well-being. So, and here we can see Jewish organization or Jewish associations called Now Mod, which has been created after Kaddish for Gaza, and on their social media there are all sorts of comments. So the third reason is boundaries. So boundaries between personal and professional life are sometimes blurred on social media. So here is an example of UJIA, so United Jewish Israel Appeal, Director of Strategy decided to post official statement on Kaddish for Gaza on his own Facebook page, although UJIA has official Facebook page. So how do you decide where to post things? So this is the official statement. It has it is signed by Chief Executive and Director of Strategy, but it is posted on the personal account. So, and the question I had, where is the line? How do you decide? And the last reason why I chose this topic is that very few Jewish organizations refer to Jewish principles when they write a policy on social media. So let's take, for example, Tikkun Olam. It's well-known concept for social action involvement of a synagogue. So when we preach, teach on social action, we would probably use terms like Tikkun Olam, Gemilut Chasadim, and others. But when it comes to social media, definitions are either on surface, definitions are either inadequate, I think, or just simply wrong. Or sometimes the Jewish organizations don't refer to any Jewish concepts when it comes to internet or social media. So, what is included in the dissertation? So, the first I studied the subject of internet communication in general, and created a list of characteristics of the internet communication. What makes internet unique or different from offline, from face-to-face communication? So then I researched the subject of internet ethics and the way how internet and social media changed some of the ethical approaches. We will come to it in a moment. Then I studied best practice. So I identified one particular area which had to adjust to the new reality and develop its own best practice with regard to internet communication. And this area is journalism. So journalists had to adjust to the new reality of social media. So I studied their best practice in order to use in my guidelines. So then I studied contemporary protocols of Jewish codes of conduct, which progressive Jewish organizations apply to their work today. And as a result, I used best parts of them in my guidelines. And the largest chapter of my dissertation is dedicated to Jewish concepts of ethical communication, which I argue can be applied to the online world of social media. I also argue that these concepts are meaningful for the online world and should be used, should be consulted for the purpose of making ethical decisions with respect to Jewish organizational use of social media. So the result of the first chapter, the characteristics of internet communication, is the list of characteristics which helps to understand the context of the online world. So the internet or social media can potentially be, it doesn't have to be always, but can potentially be persistent, spreadable, searchable, anonymous, large, active at the same time non-reciprocal, reachable, clustered, and fluid. So how it can affect Jewish social media? For example, it is much easier to shift from one group on Facebook to another than to switch synagogue. And this is one thing which happens. So a person can be a member of a number of organizations, and it's very easy to stop following certain people or organizations. I won't look further on this. You can read. You can read if you want. So the next two chapters, the study of ethical approaches of social media and best practice used by journalists, resulted in these two paragraphs. So we encourage meaningful participation of all our members and readers to influence, determine, and revise our content by means of discussion. We emphasize the need to respect social media users, encourage more inclusivity and diversity, and maintain partnership between producers and receivers of social media content. What's important here? For example, let's take the area of journalism. Editors and yes.
Still there.
Okay. The editors used to be gatekeepers for content when it comes to TV, newspaper, and radio and every other media, apart from social media. On social media, editors are no longer that powerful when it comes to gatekeeping, because sometimes the comments on the article are more influential than the article itself. So, and that's why, rather than trying to control people and to stop them to leave comments, it is the only way forward is to create partnership between readers and writers and creators of the content. So in practice, we have an ethical council, or I advise the synagogue to have an ethical council formed from equal representation of producers and receivers of the social media content, which bases its decision on the agreed code of ethics. The main goal for this council is to oversee and produce social media content on behalf of the organization and to enforce sanctions if necessary. What's important here, that this body, the ethics council, should have possibility to enforce sanctions, should have power. The larger the body is, the more serious the sanctions should be. So if it doesn't have any power to apply sanctions, it's almost useless. The next one is Jewish concepts, and from now on I will focus on the Rabbinic literature chapter, where I studied main principles of ethical communication, and there are 4 main principles which many articles and many books use more frequently than others. And this is why I chose these 4. Lashon hara, Hebrew for evil tongue or evil speech. Motzi Shem Ra, or Rechilut, Hebrew for gossip. Motzi Shem Ra, Hebrew for putting out an evil name. And Onad Dvarim, Hebrew for oppression with words or verbal abuse. So I will focus on Lashon Hara now, because it's way too much material to share in half an hour. So for this presentation I made a selection of some texts which I found interesting and useful for me, which helped me to understand the concept of Lashon Hara. So some texts appear. So what I did, I found all the appearances of these four terms in four sources: in Yerushalmi, in Palestinian Talmud, in Bavli, in Tosefta, and in Mishnah. So I used for it Bar-Ilan database, and also checked with some articles whether I missed something or not. So, and as a result, this is how I did it behind the scenes. So I made a mind map with all the sources, with all the appearances, and then summarized it in the work. So some texts appear to confuse Lashon Hara with other terms. For example, in Mishnah, the phrase Lashon Hara appears only once in the whole Mishnah, in Mishnah Arachim, and it begins with a statement about another concept, Motzi Shem Ra. So, okay, it doesn't. So it begins with Motzi Shem Ra, and then it ends as if Motzi Shem Ra means Lashon Hara. So it confuses two terms. It writes as if the terms are the same. So this is one of the examples. I will focus more on the other texts. That's why for Lashon Hara, I mostly focused on Talmud, Yerushalmi and Bavli. So in Bavli, the term Lashon Hara mostly refers to a case when someone reveals a negative information about someone else. So what I personally didn't expect to see is that sometimes Bavli refers to a case in which person reveals positive information about someone else and calls it Lashon Hara. So after one of such cases, so someone reveals something positive, the name of author of a good teaching, and then a rabbi called this Lashon Hara. Don't do that, it's Lashon Hara. So and then the Talmud, the Stam, the anonymous voice of Talmud asks a question. My Lashon Hara. So what Lashon Hara are you talking about? It's not Lashon Hara. So, and then there is a teaching in the name of Rav Dimi, and then Rav Dimi taught, Leolam al yisaper adam betovato shel chavero. A person should never speak of something positive about his fellow. Which is curious. So, shemitoch tavato ba lidei ra'ato. That as through his goodness, which means his positive information about this person, comes his evil. So in this case, when I share something which I consider positive about someone else, some of you may consider it negative. So it's like I say, oh, I saw this person at a synagogue yesterday, and some of you may know that this person said that he was ill, for example, and didn't come to the meeting with some of you, for example. And that's why sometimes positive can end up being negative. So this is one of the examples. So according to this position, everyone should be very careful to reveal any information about another person. So another text comes from Yerushalmi Sanhedrin. It offers an interpretation on the biblical story from the book of Joshua, when Joshua asks, so in the story, Achan makes a confession before death, before his death, basically. And what happens is that in Joshua, Joshua says to Achan, my son, pay honor to the Eternal One, the God of Israel, and make confession to him. And then tell me what you have done. So, and the Talmud finds it a bit curious, a bit odd, because confession, Joshua asks Achan to make confession to God, and then says, tell me what you have done, and not God. So the Talmud interprets it as if the second part of the verse applies to Joshua talking to God. So Joshua asks then God, God, tell me what Achan just said to you. So, and the Yerushalmi interprets it the same way. And this is God's answer to Joshua. I don't publicize. אינני מפרסם כל בריאה ולא עוד אלא נמצאתי אומר לשון הרע. I don't publicize secrets of any creature, and not only that, but I would find myself saying, if I did so, I would find myself saying lashon hara. So God refuses to say lashon hara about other person. So therefore, Yerushalmi states that God refuses to be involved in lashon hara. It may be an attempt to appeal to the theological principle of imitatio Dei, people's obligation to imitate God's action. So Yerushalmi pair equates lashon hara to ultimate sins of denying God and neglecting Torah, and lists it as a severe sin alongside the three transgressions which demand martyrdom. So, ארבעה דברים שהן נפרעים מן האדם בעולם הזה. So there are four things which a person punished for in this world, but the capital remains for him in the world to come. And these are, אילו הן, עבודה זרה, גילויי עריות, שפיכות דמים. So, idolatry, forbidden sexual relationship, shedding of blood, ולשון הרע כנגד כולן. And evil speech is equal to them all. Some of you may be familiar with liturgy, which says that ותלמוד תורה כנגד כולן. So that in a way, this phrase, the Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, comes from Bavli. And this is a parallel, this is a parallel text to the Bavli, which basically I drew a parallel so that the Torah is an equivalent of everything good in the world, and Lashon Hara is an equivalent of everything bad which happens in the world. So, why it is important to me? I think that these are important texts because they emphasize a very serious attitude towards speech in the text of our tradition. It makes the concept of Lashon Hara more likely to be accepted by Jewish communities when we put it in the context of some more familiar concepts. So, Yerushalmi Yoma discusses the question of atonement for Lashon Hara. So Rabbi Simi, for two matters there was no atonement, but Torah established an atonement for them, and these are the one who says evil speech, Lashon Hara, and the one who commits unintentional murder. So, and what is the atonement for Lashon Hara, according to Yerushalmi? So it discusses the fact that high priest had to wear bells on his clothes. So on Yom Kippur, so the Yerushalmi claims that the reason why Aaron had to wear bells on Yom Kippur is Yavo Kol v'yichaper al Kol. The sound or the voice of bells comes and atones for the sound of Lashon Hara. So the fact that there are bells which were heard in public for everyone, it was done. It was high priest wore them to atone for Lashon Hara spoken in public. So I found similar idea in Bavli, and it also states that the robe of the high priest atones for Lashon Hara. And the Bavli text takes the position that the robe of the high priest was seen in public and heard in public, which brings an atonement for Lashon Hara spoken in public. But also the school of Rabbi Ishmael elaborates on it and brings Baraita, which elaborates that incense sacrifices, which high priest had to bring on Yom Kippur, which, by the way, are done in private. So it was done in close within the walls or in the tent. So something that is done in secret, meaning that the incense sacrifice, which is burned in private in the sanctuary, come and atone for an act done in secret. So here we have teaching which distinguishes public Lashon Hara from private Lashon Hara. So I think that, for example, if we take a social media context, so probably we should distinguish. One thing is when I wrote someone a private message, or if I posted it on my wall in a public area. So, and I think it's emphasized in the Talmud teaching as well. So most texts speak about the violation of Lashon Hara. Bavli offers positive reinforcement as well, not just punishment for Lashon Hara, but positive reinforcement for those who refuse to engage in Lashon Hara. So Talmudic sages note that Jeroboam, the king Jeroboam, was privileged to be counted in Hosea 1 together with righteous kings of Judah, although it is explicitly said in the 2 Kings that he did what was displeasing to the Eternal One. So how come he deserved to be listed among the righteous kings? And the answer which Bavli suggests is that in Amos 7 there is a priest, Amaziah, who told Jeroboam that Amos was conspiring against him, but the king refused to believe the priest. So king refused to believe Lashon Hara, and that's why he deserved to be listed among other righteous kings. So, and again, taking it into social media context, it is not probably enough just to punish people, just to apply sanctions for those who engage in Lashon Hara, but also probably to say thank you for not to use positive reinforcement, to acknowledge the fact that the person didn't or refused to be engaged in Lashon Hara. So now this is the time to open your booklets. And on the first page you see on the first is general principles. It's setting the context, the theoretical context about what social media is, and then the 2 paragraphs based on the ethical approach and the best practice. And the second, the point 2, is code of ethics. And here is a list of all concepts, of all principles which I found. Not just 4 of the initial ones, but also those who I picked up on the way as well. So, for example, Lashon Hara, my definition of Lashon Hara is, according to the Babylonian Talmud, there is a severe prohibition against the unnecessary publicity. And this is, I found this the most accurate definition of Lashon Hara. Unnecessary publicity of negative or positive private information about another person. There are circumstances when Lashon Hara is permissible or even required. For example, one can bring a negative report to the Beit Din, Rabbinic court, without fear of speaking Lashon Hara. According to the Palestinian Talmud, Lashon Hara applies to the explicit or implicit, public or private statements that reveal true or false information about someone without their consent. a benefit for the speaker is not a necessary condition for a statement to be considered Lashon Hara. Atonement for Lashon Hara is possible and indeed required. For the public statements of Lashon Hara, both Talmudim require public appearance. For the Lashon Hara spoken in private, there should be a private act of atonement. So, it's rather long definition, but this is, I think, can be applied to social media. For example, if Lashon Hara was spoken in private message, the apology should be expressed personally by means of private message to those to whom it was expressed in the first place. If Lashon Hara was spoken in public, for example on someone's Facebook feed, the apology should be made in the same way with the same privacy settings. An organization should find a way to acknowledge those who choose the language which doesn't contradict the principle of Lashon Hara, or those who publicly refuse to be engaged in an unethical conversation online. So the second term is Avak Lashon Hara, and this is a complicated term, but according to the Babylonian Talmud, there is an advice to be cautious about sharing positive information about someone, even for the benefit of this person. According to the Palestinian Talmud, this applies to the telling of white lie or concealing the part of the truth for the sake of achieving or keeping peace between people. So I think that these concepts balance each other. So this is why this is not a law, but this is a code of ethics. And sometimes the ethics council should take more strict position, sometimes more lenient. But there are tools for that. Bal machloket is my favorite personal term. It is contagious personal troublemaker, whom it is permissible to report to authorities without fear of violating of the concept of Lashon Hara. So Talmud has a term for what is called troll nowadays. So lo ta'amot al dam ra'echa, which is the biblical concept, the requirement to protect others from harm, even if it requires breaking laws of Lashon Hara. This is why Lashon Hara is unnecessary publicity. It means that sometimes it is necessary to make something public. Apay telata, the position that information that was revealed in front of three people becomes public knowledge, or inevitably will become public knowledge, and thus the laws of Lashon Hara do not apply. So with regard to social media, it can be done. It doesn't have to, but it can be applied in a way that an information should be no longer considered private if it is shared on the private group or chat with three or more people, unless the speaker explicitly asks for confidentiality. So this is how it can be applied. Motzi Shem Ra. Motzi Shem Ra is the concept which is mostly, in most cases, throughout rabbinic literature, applies to a very specific biblical understanding of the term, which is the accusation of a woman to be not virgin on the day of marriage. But there are instances where Talmud and rabbinic literature says that Motzi Shem Ra is severe prohibition against false allegation in general and spreading bad reputation about someone. Motzi Shem Ra doesn't require any action rather than words in order to consider it valid. So words are enough. Merit, good reputation of the speaker, or inability to obtain the evidence doesn't exempt one from sanctions. So rechilut is gossip, prohibition against gossip, but it also applies to prohibition to reveal minority opinion from collective decisions in public. So it comes from the case with the rabbinic court, when two or three rabbis had one position and one had minority position. So one with minority position is not allowed to say that, I didn't decide that. It was those two. So this is so once it becomes collective decision, one cannot. It's against the principle of rechilut to reveal the minority opinion of collective decisions, which might be questionable, but sometimes when a group of people are in charge of social media content of an organization, and one can easily say, it was my decision, I didn't write this, Yes. So there are other concepts as well, and the last one, which I find also meaningful, which I took almost entirely from the liberal Judaism code of conduct, which is Dina de Malchut Dina. The law of the country is binding, and in certain cases overrides Jewish law. And there's a list of laws which apply to social media engagement in the UK, and of course they are not. This is not a comprehensive way to determine these laws, but at least there's a list. Then the rest of the code is practical application, which I mostly took from other codes of conduct with some adjustments. So, for example, number 3.3, role and structure of the Ethics Council, and this is what I would advise a synagogue to think through to create due process and of Ethics Council, of dealing with reports of confidentiality and other issues. And points 5, 6, 7, and 8 is a very practical, very applied part where people which I think would be helpful for a synagogue to think through in order to understand what do we do when we hear positive comments about our synagogue, for example, organization online. What do we do when we hear something negative? What if it's a question? What if it's a respectful comment? What if it's disrespectful comment? And this I think more or less comprehensive comprehensive questions, which I think can really help to navigate in the world of social media.
So the second presentation this morning's session is from Zahavit Shalev, who is going to be talking about the Jewish theology of sleep. If you could sit down quickly, please, that would be great.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming. So my dissertation was entitled Sleep as a 60th of Death, a Jewish Theology of Sleep. I'm going to spend a few minutes just taking you through content-wise what it was that I covered, and then I've got a teaching element which is entitled Are There Better Things for a Jew to Do Than Sleep? And I'll be taking you through a few sources. So I'm just going to tell you, I approached this project, I imagined that I was writing 4 essays and the technical term is smushing them together. So I had 4 distinct areas of research, and then I wrote an introduction and a conclusion. The introduction I entitled Otherwhere. I explained my personal motivation for desiring a deeper understanding of the relationship between sleep and death, and why I think it's important to talk about sleep as a spiritual activity in Jewish life. It's a bigger question that I don't think we value sleep in Western thought. Specifically in Jewish thought, we have a contested idea that there's a finite amount of time for anything to happen, and that sleep is an incursion into time that could be better used for other things. I'll leave you to guess. I'll come back in a moment and explain further. In chapter 1, I talked about how we used to sleep. I looked at pre-industrial sleep. There was amazing literature around that talks about how people used to sleep before the invention of electric lighting. That enabled me to have a kind of sensitivity to the ancient world or older times. I looked then mostly in the Bavli, but through other bits of rabbinic literature to see what the rabbis considered to be normal sleep. I looked for mentions of people's sleep behaviour. And as I said, there was lots to help me think about how sleep was generally conceptualised before the last 100 or so years. My second chapter, How to Sleep Jewishly, I looked specifically at legal and liturgical frameworks around sleep. That meant looking at the Kriyat Shema al-Hamitah, what do we say in the Shema at night that tells us what we think sleep is. And then the bedtime, and then the morning prayer rites. What prayers do we say in the morning, and what do they tell us about what we imagine it is to wake up from sleep? If I was going to give a shout out, I would say that Dr. Jeremy Schonfield's teaching was really important to me here as well. He's got a fantastic way of looking at liturgy and using anthropology and psychoanalysis to sort of explore what the liturgy is doing and the truths it represents about an idea. In the third chapter, this is where my literary self got to indulge. Where do I go when I sleep? I looked specifically at many midrashim that talked about where we are when we sleep, or whether our soul goes adventuring and the kinds of adventures it goes on. I also surrounded this with the work of some contemporary philosophers who talk about the trouble that we in Western thought have of conceiving as a self as including a sleeping self. They go a bit further. They also say we don't mind the dreaming self, because the dreaming self is still an intellectual self that's defined by sort of Cartesian ideas about a brain that thinks and can make sense of the world. But the dreamless sleep is a real problem for our definition of self, one we're very reticent to incorporate our dreamless sleeping selves into our sense of ourselves. We imagine that we have continuity and we skip over the periods of sleep. This also took me into looking at several versions of the story about Choni the circle maker who slept for 70 years. He's our Jewish version of Rip Van Winkle and of many, many much more ancient myths about long sleepers in world literature. There were lots of interesting things to say about why that trope was so present and what it sort of meant. So that was a whole other adventure, chapter 3. Chapter 4, I looked at, and I'm going to bring you some of this material now, I looked at occasions when deviation from sleep norms are sanctioned. When are we allowed to not do our normal sleeping, and what possible reasons are there? I had a whole other area, which was looking at, in traditional Jewish texts, whether God sleeps. That also took me a bit further back into ancient Middle Eastern religions and ideas about godly beings, and you'd be surprised, but actually gods definitely sleep. It's part of being a god is that you sleep. If you are sufficiently powerful, then going offline is not a threat to your authority or your power. So actually it's very, very clear that in the ancient Near East, gods definitely slept. And if you want to know more, I have all the material. I also looked at monastic and maternal sleep habits. And I won't say, but that kind of informed, I'm not going to say more, there's too much there. And then untangling the web of associations between rest, sleep and Shabbat. We talk about having invented the Sabbath, and we're very big on the idea about the rest, about Sabbath being a rest, but if you look at literature about Shabbat, it doesn't talk about sleep. And when it does, it's very, very stressed out about the idea that you would sleep on Shabbat, and I will be sharing some of that with you. My conclusion was an attempt to formulate the beginning of a Jewish theology of sleep. Christian and Jewish theologians are very in love with this verse from the Song of Songs, I'm asleep but my heart is awake. There are various midrashic treatments that kind of explore what it is to have a self that is both here on the earth and somewhere in some other way connected with the divine or with the spiritual realm or with other parts of the universe or of life. And that's what that verse enables thinkers to discuss. So, and I played with that as well. I wanted very much to champion the Shabbat Shalev in my conclusion. And then I also wanted to return to my opening quote, which was, what is it? What would it mean that sleep is a dilute form of death? Anyway, so I did that. Today's presentation is, are there better things for a Jew to do than sleep? Partly the material that I showed you, that I think I did in chapter 3, sanctioned opportunities for not sleeping, or where we deviate from normal sleep behaviour. And then I begin to talk a little bit about the Shabbat Shalev, and I'll tell you a bit about what that means to me as well. I've got, I made some handouts which may have gone out, but I'm going to I only brought 10, but I'm going to show the same material on the screen. So I hope that will be, thank you, Igor. I hope that will be readable to people. Thank you. And just show me how to scroll up and down. Okay. So I think I've cannibalised my own material. I've taught a great deal of the material from my dissertation already. I've probably notched up about 8 hours worth of teaching. And I do use Safaria. That's the software that I use to create my shiurim, and it's not academic and professional, but it does enable me to do a relaxed format in which I can talk about sources and annotate them and invite people to share them and look at them with me. Are there better things for a Jew to do than to sleep? Yes, of course. Learn Torah is an obvious thing that you're supposed to do rather than sleep. Pirkei Avot says, such is the way of Torah: eat bread with salt, drink small amounts of water and sleep on the ground, live a life of privation and toil in Torah. If you do this, happy shall you be, and it shall be good for you. So the most biggest competition for sleep, and I don't know how to make this mouse work, in Jewish culture is, of course, Torah. Anything that takes you away from Torah is a waste of time. It's bitul Torah. So surely minimising of sleep would be a great thing to do if it allowed you to study more. And you see a lot of heroics in contemporary rabbis as well. Thank you, Deborah. I'm sorry. You see a lot of heroics, lots of stories. I mean, Margaret Thatcher was the most obvious recent example of someone who claims to apparently never sleep because they are so busy, they have so much capacity and so much to do. So obviously we have our own sort of hall of fame of people who apparently didn't sleep because they had better things to do. Starting with Moses up Mount Sinai, God said, by the way, these are my translations. It's not fully academic, but I did do my own translations. God said to Moses, it was good for me that I was humbled, so that I might learn your laws. That's a quote from Psalms. And then it was to Moses' credit, he was given 120 days on Mount Sinai when he received the Torah. And how do we know that he did lo yashan v'lo nidnamnen? He neither slept nor even dozed. It's a bit like a king who loved his servant. And he said to the servant, measure out for yourself golden dinars. The servant was so overjoyed, he did not need to eat or drink. Lo bikesh, lo lachol v'lo lishtot. Bikesh lishon, he required or needed or sought or asked to sleep. But then he said, Imishan ani mafsidelu. If I sleep, I'll forgo these. So he recognised that it's a zero-sum game, sleeping and collecting golden dinars. The Holy One says, "Don't worry, you're not gonna miss out. I'm going to make sure that I amplify the amount of golden dinars of Torah that you're going to be able to pick up. Not only am I giving you the 10 Commandments, I'm giving you the entirety of the oral law, and that." I guess it's a self-fulfilling prophecy as well. There's now so much more Torah to learn that you will never need to sleep again. And I'm really sorry, this wasn't professional formatting on my part. King David is the origin, the psalm. King David in the Psalm 119 says, I get up at midnight, I rise to give thanks. And this is an important trope for all this heroics about not sleeping. This is kind of where it originates. And actually later on I'm going to tell you something about Tikkun Chatzot, which is a prayer service that the Lurianic Kabbalists developed, where they specifically ask people to get up in the middle of the night and say more prayers, because they may not have said enough in the daytime. So it's all hooked onto that verse, but it's about piety. So David says before the Holy One, Master of the universe, am I not pious? As all of the kings of the east and the west sleep until the third hour, but me, at midnight, I rise to give thanks. So lots of talk about how mortals can sleep, but super Jews do not sleep because they have best things to do. Noah in the ark, and actually Noah's not really Jewish, so it's interesting that we go all the way back here. Noah, I think also, I like this very much because I think this is beginning to be approaching something else, and I'll explain in a minute. Our master said, the 12 months that Noah spent in the ark, lo ta'am sheina, he did not even taste a tiny bit of sleep, neither in the day or at night. שהיה עוסק לזון את הנפשות שהיו עמו. He was completely occupied feeding, really, those souls that were with him. And then it gives a quote from Proverbs. Now, what's interesting, then there's the discussion about the schedule that the animals ate on. And it kind of explains why there was no time to sleep, because all the animals needed feeding at different times. I think what's lovely about this is it brings the feminine in a disguised form into a discussion about sleep. And later on, I got to look at the experience of nursing mothers and to call on my own experience and to talk about this state that actually it has a French word, dorveil. Dorveil is the sort of state between wake and sleep. And if you've ever sat up at night with a baby, then you are neither fully conscious nor fully asleep. You have a special state of consciousness that you only get when you're feeding in the middle of the night. And Noah has it here. So this allowed me to sort of talk about the maternal experience. So those guys are very important people. But should everyone go without sleep? I didn't bring all the oppositional voices, but I wanted you to see that there is some condemnation that people who don't sleep are setting themselves up in a way that's not okay. One who stays awake at night, one who wanders on a road alone, and one who turns his heart to idleness. Mitchayev benafsho, they forfeit their soul. Now that could be a kind of death sentence, or it could be a sort of metaphorical condemnation, but it's about personal endangerment and about the risks associated with staying awake, forgoing sleep, which are just as bad as deviations from other kinds of normal human behaviour. So it's not for everyone, even if it was for King David and Moses and Noah. Thank you again, Deborah. There's a further discussion about what happens if somebody makes a vow and says, Konam she'ani yashen, I am forbidding myself, I'm making a vow that I will not sleep. They find this very, very problematic, the rabbis. Essentially, they say it's an unmaintainable oath, and you're setting yourself up to commit a very cardinal and severe sin. And in fact, Rabbi Yochanan says later on in the discussion, if anyone who utters, I'm not going to sleep for 3 days, we should beat them, the courts should beat them, and then they should go straight to bed. Straight to their room. So that's very intriguing. It's very intriguing. So there's a sort of understanding that it's not possible to completely deny oneself sleep, and that's this other voice that we see, which there's more of. This is a fantastic story now about the kind of antinomian tendencies that can sort of erupt when people break the rules. So we know that the high priest would stay awake on Yom Kippur night because he had to do a bunch of rites on Yom Kippur morning. The real reason he had to stay awake on Yom Kippur night was because he was likely to be a fairly young man, and he was in a state of tahora, and they were worried that they basically felt that every time anyone falls asleep, if they're a man, they have a seminal emission. So it's just safest for the high priest to stay awake all night. And there's a whole practice about keeping them awake. There's a description about people snapping their fingers at him and saying, get up, walk around, and they're keeping him awake. Now, what happens is that a support structure kind of develops. Everybody's staying awake to keep the high priest awake. And then it turned out that the prominent people of Jerusalem would also stay awake so that the noise would travel from the city into the temple precincts. But it's really party central once this is happening. I mean, if everybody's awake, then it's not normal anymore. And what now happens is there's this horrible anecdote. Someone says lots of sinning is going on, and they talk about Nahadia as a particularly heinous sort of neighbourhood. And they say, why has the Messiah not come? Isn't today Yom Kippur? And relations were had with several virgins in Nahadia. In other words, people were partying on Yom Kippur night. Men and women were partying on Yom Kippur night, and naughtiness occurred, and that's what happens when people stay out all night. And it's really inappropriate for Yom Kippur. So we're kind of exploring this, but then it transpires that it's not so inappropriate on other occasions for people to have fun, and we'll get there shortly. So on Rosh Hashanah, there began to develop a sort of spreading of this idea of sleeplessness. So here we've got the Rambam talking about the meaning of Rosh Hashanah. And he says, even though we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, as it's a scriptural commandment, metaphorically what we're saying is, wake up, sleepy people, get out of your sleep and do teshuvah and remember who you are and what you need to do. And so very early on, and actually Rambam is taking that from an earlier source, I don't remember exactly where, but this association with the shofar as waking us up out of our metaphorical sleep. So there's this idea that wakefulness is alertness and it's important on the high holy days because they're an important time. Thank you, Deborah. Later on, it transpires that there is in fact a minhag that's mentioned by Moses Isilis, I think, so much later on in his gloss on the Shulchan Aruch, I think, where he says that actually some people there's people not sleeping during the day on Rosh Hashanah. That's quite a strong minhag, lest I think it's to do with the whole language around staying awake, and also that it would be a bad omen for the coming year if you slept during Rosh Hashanah. But it's attributed sort of in a way that you can't actually find a solid link to the Jerusalem Talmud. And so here we have the suggestion by the Ramah, actually you should stay awake and definitely not take a nap on Rosh Hashanah. Now, then there are celebratory occasions that we know about when maybe partying is acceptable. For example, at the ceremony of the water drawing celebration, where the rabbis boast that they partied so hard that they did not sleep the entire festival of Sukkot, essentially. And then they bring this discussion, but we know that not sleeping is really not a good thing, and the court will flog a person who declares that they'll not sleep for 3 days. And they say now, well, it was just we were having such a great time that we kind of fell asleep on each other's shoulders because we were staying up partying, having a good time. So now we've entered the Regalim, we've had Sukkot, we've got Pesach. Now Pesach also, in Torah, Pesach is Leil Shomorim. It's a night of vigilance. It's the night when God looked after the Israelites. It's basically the labour and birth of Am Yisrael. So labour pains often go on through the night, and there's birth pangs, and there's the exodus from Egypt, and there's leaving Mitzrayim, and all of the language is a sort of disguised version of a kind of birthing narrative. And we also have the mitzvah of staying up for the Seder and having our eating. Originally it was the Korban Pesach, and then it was the Afikoman, and there's a whole idea that you're staying up very late. It's a special occasion with special late night celebrations. And then the rabbis start to worry about interruptions to these celebrations. They say, in fact, that if the parties at the Seder fall asleep in the middle of the celebrations, then does that mean that the Seder's over, and even though you didn't drink 4 cups of wine or eat your Afikoman, game's over? Or can you be woken up to continue to participate in the Seder? And then there's a whole discussion where they specifically talk about the difference between dozing and sleeping, and it becomes a discussion amongst the rabbis. What is dozing, what is sleeping? What constitutes absenting oneself from one's consciousness, and what is merely nodding off and then returning and being back in the space again? Once you've got 2 of the regalim, what the heck, you might have a 3rd one. So on Shavuot we have this tradition. It's a kind of solstice festival. There are many, many hours of daylight. And the story that we all know, which explains the etiological tale about Tikkun Leil Shavuot, is that we overslept on the morning of Matan Torah. Again, maybe we were excited, it was daylight, we stayed awake late, we went to sleep late, and then we overslept, and God came to Mount Sinai, and he was the bridegroom, ready to lead the bride to enter the bridal chamber, and she hadn't arrived. So the Tikkun Leil Shavuot is a penance. It's our attempt to stay awake the whole night so that we'll be there for Matan Torah on the morning of Shavuot. So you've actually got now, I've named so many occasions where disrupted, not normal, deviant sleep is permitted, and I can just tell you that Shemini Atzeret also became a thing, partly because it's another Torah festival. It comes before your Simchat Torah, so you might want to finish learning Torah before the cycle ends. Partly Shemini Atzeret is also the final last chance saloon for teshuvah before your fate is sealed for the coming year, so it's another reason. It's also a parallel to Shavuot, another Torah festival. And the first Tikkun Leil Shavuot, really, even though we have that midrash going way, way back, in fact, the first real Tikkun Leil Shavuot happened between Solomon Alkabetz and Joseph Caro, somewhere in the 1530s in Svat, where they decided to invent the ritual. They knew that midrash, and there were many traditions about the bridegroom and the bride and unification and the wedding day, and they sort of said, and I like to imagine them with a spliff in their hands, actually, because it sounds like a really mad idea. They kind of said, let's make a ritual about staying up all night to do the bridegroom-bride unification thing, wedding thing in the morning, and they invented a ritual, which they almost plucked out of thin air. It hadn't previously existed, and it spread. Now, it spread for several reasons, but most certainly one of them was coffee, because by then coffee was around, and Muslim Sufi explorers, I guess, spiritual explorers, were beginning to use coffee. It had become available through various trade routes. And so this opened up a new frontier for doing stuff in the middle of the night when you would otherwise not really be able to sustain the momentum. Another night for staying awake is, and Tikkun Chatzot, which was the invention of this entirely new prayer ritual, really happened in exactly the same sphere as Tikkun Leil Shavuot. It's the same sort of people. It has a different backstory, but it's emerging at the same time. This getting up in the middle of the night to do another prayer cycle. That also is informed by a sort of arms race with Christians who had getting up in the middle of the night type prayers as well, and so we needed to keep up. So I feel that might be part of it. The night before a circumcision is called Vachnacht. It's an Ashkenaz tradition, and I feel it's very connected to the language of Leil Shimurim. But it's also connected to Christian ideas, which are really probably more pagan in origin, that your baby who you're going to perform a circumcision on is, you've got to watch over them. You've got to keep a vigil over that baby on the night before they're brit. So all of that. Oi, I'm tired. What about a Shabbos shluff? So having explored that there were, so many exceptions to the rule of sleep being an acceptable thing to do, so many better things that you could do rather than sleep. I was very interested to find the origins of the phrase Shena b'Shabbat ta'anug. It's a popular folk saying. It's an acronym. Shena, sleep b'Shabbat, on Shabbat ta'anug, is a machaya, is a pleasure. It's often said that Shabbat is this acronym that means sleeping on Shabbat is a pleasure. I couldn't find it happening any earlier than about 1500, which was kind of what I expected, because sleep deprivation wasn't a thing until there was electric light anyway, essentially. Until there was reliable sources of lighting, nobody was massively sleep deprived because there was very little to compete with going to sleep. So the idea that you might want to use Shabbat to catch up on sleep only really kicked in once people began to be sufficiently sleep deprived that they felt they needed that. And then, of course, I'm bringing you full circle to some of what we've seen, which is that there's going to be a contest between what you do on Shabbat. Is it about Torah? Is it about rest? The Tor, who is Jacob Ben Asher from the 1300s, and his halachic code, he says, look, some people are accustomed to take a daily nap in the afternoon, so they certainly should take one on Shabbat. They shouldn't forego it. But everybody also says you wouldn't want to waste time that you could otherwise be learning Torah. So there's quite a lot of subsequent halachic writers who say, well, of course you can sleep as long as you're using it to be brighter and sharper for your study of Torah on Shabbat. And that kind of hesitancy is very interesting. It's completely expected. I wanted to just illuminate one more thing, and then maybe I will see if anybody has any more questions in a few moments. There's a midrash, said the Torah to the Holy One, Lord of the universe, when Israel entered the land, this one will run to his orchard, and that one will run to his field, and what will happen to me? So Torah and Israel are married. But there is an anxiety that once Israel enters the promised land, there will be competition. And this frequently happens. There's a sort of a slightly messy menage between the elements in the story. And so God says, To Torah, I have a partner who will match you. Her name is Shabbat. For they are free from their work on Shabbat and will be able to attend to you. Now that is very unclear, because now we have the Holy One trying to manage this confusing liaison between Torah and the land and Israel and Shabbat. Right? At different times we say Israel is married to Torah, or Israel is married to the land of Israel, or Israel is married to Shabbat. The days of the week marry each other. There are 6 of them, but Israel is married to Shabbat. There is an unsolvable problem as to when to sleep, given that you could be doing Torah. And that was what I bumped up against, and what I very much wanted, and Keith actually also invited me to sort of push a bit harder. Can we discover a Jewish value to sleep and promote sleep as Jewishly meaningful and not in constant conflict with Torah, not as a source of bittul Torah? And I think I did. I mean, I began by wanting to explore what I thought my Shabbat Shlev meant to me. I'm just going to say something very brief here, and then I think I'll close. But I think that there is a religious value and meaning in sleep. We are very wholly and deeply part of the web of life when we are asleep. We're actually more part of the web of life when we're asleep than when we're awake, because all living entities sleep, and some of us perform intellectual acrobatics during some of our hours of life, but babies don't, and people who are cognitively impaired don't, and very old people don't, and jellyfish and plankton and grass and stuff don't, but we are all part of the web of life. So there's something much more authentic about the life that we lead when we are more organic and vegetative. It's meaningful and it's powerful, and it's not something to run away from. So being in touch with that aspect of life is very powerful, very holistic. I think that we should relish sleep. It's humbling, which I feel is really key. It's holy. And it changes us. I think that things go on unbeknownst to us in sleep, which I regard as very much a part of our spiritual development. And undoubtedly, sleep is a spiritual training ground for death. And that's another thing that I think that, in Western culture, and to some extent in Jewish culture, death is a sort of tumah, it's a kind of otherness, it's fearful. But we are very familiar with death, because sheina echad mishishim lemita. Sleep is a dilute form, it's 1/60th of death. So we have a familiarity, we have an awareness, and we can cultivate a kind of comfort and ease and a fearlessness around something that is already familiar to us in the way that we live. And actually maybe I'll just leave this as a final thought. I think the Eastern religions are much better at talking about different states of consciousness, and talking about everything being one, and talking about a kind of equanimity and a kind of familiarity with this is just how it is. But I think that in cultivating the Jewish theology of sleep, we begin to find our own language for talking about what it is to be a whole, total being.
By the looks of you, nobody fell asleep during that. We have time for a few questions. If you'd like to ask, please indicate. Elliot first, and then Michael, then Vic.
Thank you very much. I wonder on the historical point of the year 1500 and around there, whether there is something to do with like the development of Protestantism, Protestant work ethic, and suddenly people feeling guilty about not working, and sleeping being kind of, you feel guilty about sleeping. There's a story about the Baroque, I can't remember, one of the Baroque composers who would ruined his eyesight because he stayed up all night without an electric light bulb, bring out music. I don't know if that's related to it, but that kind of thing maybe started happening then, because obviously the electric light bulb is not until the 20th century, so I wonder whether there's a kind of ideological thing there as well, and whether therefore Shabbat kind of became a kind of counter-cultural thing to say actually you're not only is it okay to rest, it's commanded to rest, against this kind of prevailing capitalist Protestant idea that you should always be working. If you're not working, then there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, so I think that the prevailing Protestant sort of work ethic thing is definitely a thing that informs all of us in Western culture, as you said, aided and abetted by, lighting. There was another thing as well, which I don't know if it was so much guilt about work, but I think it was. I read an article by Arthur Green where he talks about a massive blossoming of Christian mysticism in medieval Europe, and a sort of the monasteries were the centre of sort of intellectual life, and there was a lot of staying awake at night, and there was an efflorescence of sort of prayers and scholarship and all kinds of things. So, and some of the guys in SWAC were informed, they sort of came out of that milieu. So there was a sense in which it was actually it wasn't the Protestant work ethic as we know it, it was religious people are like these superhumans who are on 24/7. I think there was quite a bit of that. Later on, coffee, by the way, really was a thing. Somebody wrote a history of Jews and coffee. Coffee houses were fired Western European culture as well. They really sort of kick-started an energy, and it was happening all over the world. Yeah.
Mike?
Yes, in the description of the Tikkun Leil Shavuot in the Zohar, it talks about you've got to keep studying because it's keeping away the evil spirits and the demons. Have you come across Jewish descriptions of nightmares, night terrors, and the scary aspects of sleep?
I specifically didn't tackle dreams, so I didn't go looking for them. The liturgy around sleep is very neurotic about all the terrible things that can come and get you when you sleep. Again, main fear, nocturnal emissions, but because that is spiritual getting lostness for them. So I think what I noticed, and actually in my chapter about the liturgy of sleep, was that it's almost hysterical how much defense mechanisms are brought about in the Kriyat Shema and Hamitah. There's a lot of repeating mantric things like 3 times and 7 times. There's the thing about getting up and kissing the mezuzah a bunch of times. There's lots of instructions about which way you should lie and stuff. And all of the underlying anxiety is to do basically with evil spirits and possession and succubuses and all the rest of that. I'm pretty sure. I'm sure there's more out there about it as well.
Thank you. And Vic, you had the pleasure of supervising this dissertation.
Yeah, and it was a real joy. And it was a learning process. I felt I learned so much working with you, Zahavit, over the year, and seeing how the project slowly developed and how your thinking and feeling about the project really grew. And it started very much about this notion of death and sleep, and what it was, and what happens when we sleep. If it is a kind of death, where do we go? Where does the soul go? And what does it mean if we really take seriously what the soul leaves and returns in the morning, and in the morning it's a blessing that we have returned. So, and you said it beautifully towards the end, the notion of the web of life, and that there was something really deep that we were kind of thinking through about the way in which Jewish theology, Jewish thought, presents a kind of counter-tradition to a kind of Western tradition which focuses both on the urgency of work, but also very profoundly in terms of it's only when you're rational or conscious that you're human. And we've all learned that. And there was a way that this project, and I've learned it with you, was a real counter to the notion that we are human when we sleep and when we're passive. And in those situations which we might regard as vegetative, we are also deeply human. So that there's a kind of eco-vision that is there in the very contradictory sources. And thinking through these sources showed you that you could develop a very different kind of project that could move in a very different kind of direction. And you found the way that you really wanted to work with this, which was about sleep. And it wasn't about dreaming in the same way, but it was about that relationship to death and our relationship to those people who died, that we continue in relationship. They don't disappear for us. So the sleep is much more profound, and you've really kind of opened up that possibility with that kind of thinking. I've seen today how you've developed it almost since we've finished working, you've carried it on, so it's like...
Thank you, Vic. Thank you. There's time for one more question. You in the front. I don't know who you are. Could you say?
I'm Kol Bo, I'm Zahavit's brother.
Oh. Zahavit, as I'm sharing the session, do you want to take a question?
I just wanted to ask, if you came across any sources that spoke about different phases of sleep, some people having a sort of 3-4 hour sleep at night and having a break and sleeping again, or people taking power naps. Was there literature that addressed that?
There was enough first of all, when I read Roger E. Kirsch's History of Pre-Industrial Sleep, I was looking to see whether there was biphasic sleep in the rabbinic literature. Do people sleep in 2 chunks rather than in 1 chunk, or in several chunks in the day? So there was kind of hints. There was hints that was the case, but by the time I got there, I wasn't surprised because it was so clear from all the other literature I read, including really contemporary sleep science, that says we are designed to sleep twice in a 24-hour period and not once. So I kind of wasn't even surprised by the time I got there at the ubiquity of course, you don't just sleep at night, or of course, people do wake up in the night. There are many watches in the night, the Mishnah, the Gemara. All ancient cultures had this idea that there are different, the night is divided into phases. People wake up, they get up, they wander around, they go back to sleep. There was something of that there, yeah, and I was expecting it by then, yeah.
Thank you. Zahavit, just also reflecting on the fact that we know that there was a huge level of a consciousness of demonology in Babylonian Jewry, and thinking about the incantation bowls with the to ward off whichever evil spirit it was.
Yeah.
I mean, when you do the PhD, I'm sure that could also yield some very interesting aspects to it. And of course, anyone else who wants to speak to Laliv or Igor or other presenters, they are going to be around all day. We're going to break.
Can I say one final thing?
Sure.
So, Vic skirted around this, but working with Vic, this was very much about my mother's death. This was entirely generated by experiencing my mother dying and trying to make sense of it within a Jewish theological framework. So that runs through absolutely the whole of it, and I framed that at the beginning and the end of the whole thesis, and it was very much about trying to maintain a connection with my mother who's no longer on this plane of existence. So I'm happy that my other family members are here, my dad and my brother and my sister, because it's really, really tough. It was to honour my mother I did this.
So, I'm the Director of Jewish Education here at the college, the course team leader for the MA in Jewish Educational Leadership. So we've been graduating MA students in Jewish education for 25 years, numbering close to 50 individuals, and Avi is being added to that number as we speak. The MA in Jewish Educational Leadership prepares and develops those who are currently working in or aspiring to leadership roles within progressive Jewish educational settings. And this can include early childhood work, cheder, adult, Jewish day school education, and also informal Jewish educational contexts. The MA encourages students to become catalysts for positive change and development in Jewish education. It integrates theory with practice through opportunities for in-depth exploration and analysis of educational contexts and issues, and offers students the opportunity to research a particular field of interest. This is the first time that our graduates are presenting their MA dissertations alongside our rabbinic students, so we're very excited about it, and we hope it's a tradition that will continue for many years to come. So Avi is the first group of 4 to complete his dissertation and his MA, and on Sunday he will be there to be presented with his LBC certificate at the ordination ceremony. So I hope loads of you will be there to see that as well. So I'm delighted to invite Avi to share with us his dissertation. You will tell the title, so I won't do that. And so, without much further ado, I invite and call upon Avi to present to us. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I didn't realise I was the first. So there we go. So I thought quite a bit about how I was going to talk about, engage you with my dissertation. And in the end I decided to do it the way that I feel most comfortable, which is simply to talk and tell the story. And I hope you'll come to the same conclusion I reached when I finished this, that telling the story was exactly what happened for me in writing this dissertation and in all the work that went before I produced it. So the title of the dissertation is a study of the teaching of modern Hebrew, in brackets Ivrit, to UK Reformed Jewish children from the perspective of the teacher's lived experience. I kept it nice and short, as you can see. And there's a couple of elements there. Modern Hebrew, so Ivrit, so it's contemporary Hebrew, it's the vernacular of Israel that I was talking about, within the context of progressive Jewish children in the Reformed community, and looking at it very much from the teacher's perspective, but not just about how and what the teachers are doing, but trying to focus in on what they were experiencing, what was going on inside, and to use a term that perhaps isn't Hebrew, but what's going on in the kishkas was what I wanted to get to. So the first question I suppose I really need to address is why? Why did I pick this topic? And I think there were really two reasons, and both of them were part of my narrative. So one was having grown up as a child in the Orthodox tradition, having gone through many years of cheder. I reached bar mitzvah, and then afterwards and continued to study. One of the astonishing things was, well, my Hebrew wasn't very good. After all of that, and I went on Sunday, I went on Tuesday, I went on Thursday, and all that, my Hebrew wasn't great. And then I lived in Israel, I made Aliyah, and I lived in Israel for a number of years, and I went to Ulpan. And when I got to the Ulpan, I encountered an inspirational teacher, I have to say, who transformed me from somebody who knew very little Hebrew to somebody who was reasonably competent in Hebrew within about 3 months. And to the point that, and also one of the things that she said was, you will be able to go to the theatre and listen to a play in Hebrew, and you will understand, and you will feel part of that play. And I'd be sitting there at the end, really? And yeah, that's what happened. So I had that experience, and then I came back to the UK, got involved in a Jewish community here, and the first thing I noticed was that the experience here was exactly the same as my experience has been. People's Hebrew was pretty poor. And whether it was liturgical or just general knowledge, and particularly for the children, their Hebrew wasn't great. And they were going to cheder and they were having the classes and all of this, and it wasn't happening. It became even more compelling for me with my own son. And watching him go through cheder education within the Reformed community, and the books and the studies still not coming out with any real knowledge of Hebrew. And I thought, this is interesting. This is something I'd like to get a little further into. Something else also happened, which was my experience as, I'm going to put it in inverted commas, as an educator within the corporate world. So I spent quite a lot of my time training people, mentoring people, passing on knowledge. And one of the things that I was really aware of was that there was something different in the way that I would pass on the knowledge, depending on how I was experiencing the passing on of that knowledge. It was very intangible. It was just this sense, you come out of it and you go, yeah, that was a good session. That was okay. I haven't asked the people if it was okay for them. I just come out with that sense, yeah, that was okay. And these two kept sort of playing in my mind. And then I joined the MA course, and I was a little challenged when I joined the MA course, because it made me start to think about things. So I stopped relying just on those feelings, and yeah, that was okay, and Hebrew's not so good, is it? I started to have to question and look into things. And these two came together, and I also realised that I had a very, very deep-seated bias in my attitude towards Hebrew. And it was a very judgmental bias. In other words, I had a clear comparison. When I learnt in Cheder, when my son learnt in Cheder, outcome not good. When I learnt in Ulpan, outcome good. There we go. Question answered. Ulpan, immersive learning, Hebrew in Hebrew, that's the way to go, that's the way to do it. It would only work if only everybody would speak Hebrew, if only everyone would teach in Hebrew, it would all be fine. And that was challenged when I sort of raised that within the framework of the study, that maybe you need to go just a little bit deeper. So I did. And as part of and this was sort of towards this dissertation, I did a comparative piece looking at the experience of Jewish children in Cheder in a Reform community compared with the experience of Arab citizens of Israel learning Hebrew. And I did some comparative work to try to understand if there are any similarities and if there are any differences in the way they learned Hebrew and the outcomes and various other things. And perhaps people are sitting here and thinking, well, it's probably quite obvious, but there was really that thing of need, of instrumentality. The reason an Arab citizen of Israel will learn Hebrew is because they need to. If you want to get on in a country where the majority speaks Hebrew, you need to speak decent Hebrew. Surprisingly, a child growing up in the Reform community here can function quite well with no Hebrew. But I did a study nonetheless, just to validate that. So, we came into this piece around the dissertation, and I really needed to begin to frame what I was trying to do and what I was trying to achieve from this study. And I came to two real objectives. So one was to address that sense, that bias which I had, which was to say, actually, to be an educator, to be a better educator, to be a more complete educator, I need to look beyond those biases and begin to examine things differently. So as the objective stated, it was to advance my personal development as an educator by setting aside my biases and preconceptions through a study of the lived experience of teachers of Iwit in the community. So that was one objective. And the second one was also, I was interested in beginning to surface some thematic understanding of what was happening in those contexts, and to begin perhaps a journey towards some research in that area, not necessarily mine. Because it was very clear to me this was a really big topic, and I was just going to skim the surface. And I did some work, some literature review, and what was very clear that within this area of the experience of teachers, again, as I said, within the Kishkus, how they experience that teaching, there's very little study generally, but particularly in the context of Jewish education. So there are some studies looking at how the children are experiencing it. There are studies how they're doing. So sort of qualitative measures, is their Hebrew good, is their Hebrew not good, whatever. How many years did they study, how many are engaged, all those sorts of questions, there is some work. But actually to say, what are the teachers experiencing in this context, I didn't find very much. And that tied back again to my own experience, that sense that there's something going on inside you as you teach. I thought, this is something I want to look at. I suppose there was another element also which came into play, which was as I reviewed the literature around Hebrew and studies of what Hebrew means and what Ivrit means in sort of the modern context, it's very much tied up with the Jewish narrative, which is also my narrative, the Jewish narrative of diaspora, the Jewish narrative of return, the beginnings of the Yishuv, the emerging Jewish community in what became mandatory Palestine, the growth of Zionism, and the place that Hebrew and the relationship between Zionism and Hebrew and the politicization of Hebrew through the Zionist movement. All of those things are discussed and thought about, and I thought actually that is also part of my narrative. And I wanted to get to that sense of how is all of that playing together when somebody teaches, when somebody stands in front of a class of children and teaches a quiz. What's going on? So when I looked at the work that's been done around the Hebrew language, it's not unsurprising to see that within the Zionist thinkers, Hebrew is essential. Hebrew and Jewish identity are almost synonymous. They are almost one of the same. In fact, Ben Yehuda says it in this way: without the language of our fathers, we can't be what we are to be. And if you, again, referring to something that the Hebrew Language Academy has said, they said the miracle of the re-establishment of Hebrew as a spoken vernacular is almost as miraculous as the establishment of the state. So clearly within the Jewish consciousness, something, the collective consciousness, something is going on with Hebrew. More interesting to me was actually and I'll explain why this was interesting, was the position of Hebrew today within Israel. So there was a study by Gold back in 1989 where he talks about the normalization of Hebrew, that for Israelis, Hebrew is nothing special. It's just the language they speak. And he'd done this study. And I was also interested in that because certainly for myself, having in the diaspora who went to live in Israel, and when people are teaching, we don't teach Hebrew because it's just something that we do. For us, it has some significance. And why that particular reference was so interesting was within the study that I actually did. So I embarked on a small case study within a Reformed Jewish community. The reasons I picked a small study was simply the scope of the MA. I needed to do something that I could contain, that I could manage within the scope. So I took a Reformed Jewish Cheder where they had 4 teachers and went ahead to go on a case study, but from a phenomenological perspective, so to understand what was going on for those teachers within that context. And interestingly, they were all Israeli. So all of the teachers in this particular context were all Israeli, which was why that particular reference to Hebrew really intrigued me. And I was interested in finding out what their experience was and how they viewed the language. So there was an awful lot of work, which I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail here in the preparation of the dissertation. Looking at and discussing the tutors, the methodologies, the methods, why I chose case study, why I chose a phenomenology. I'd say one of my classmates. Thank you. So interesting. Just as a complete aside, one of the reasons I eventually fell in love with the phenomenological approach was the cafe downstairs. Because we had an exercise during the 2 years where, and I ended up with a phenomenological. I still can't say it. Of all the ones to end up with, that's the one I got. But I decided to do a phenomenological study of standing in the queue and waiting for your food down in Strudel Cafe, just to see how people actually experience that, and that in itself was interesting, but a complete aside. But in preparing this study, this phenomenological study, I had to be extremely careful about how I approached it. And the theory, at least, says that you should go into this in very open-minded, with open conversation, and really sort of go in there and start talking and start engaging, really without planning it too much, which actually suits me because I don't plan so well. But I was also guided, and I think this is a really important part of the journey. I was guided through the tutoring, through my peers, to actually be more structured within the case study and to think about the questions I needed to ask, how I was going to structure. And I found a sort of middle ground, which was structured opening questions and then allowing a dialogue to open with the people involved. I actually recorded the conversations we had for two reasons. One is because it helps me remember things, because I forget things after I've heard them. But also, I actually wanted to be really engaged in the conversation rather than sitting there scribbling down notes. And there was a whole load of ethical questions that needed to be addressed before then about recording and privacy and various other things which were covered off. And I ended up with, in the end, 3 interviews. One of the people in the cohort left the organisation, so there were only 3 to interview. And I ended up with a good few hours of conversations with them. Well, what I was concerned about was, one is just having those conversations, and then my interpretation of those conversations and my understanding of those conversations. I thought this is slightly dangerous ground to be on, because there's a real risk I'm going to still bring my opinions into the picture. First of all, I've crafted the questions. I can't guarantee that I'm not introducing bias into those questions. I'm probing certain things that interest me. And also, one of the questions around a phenomenological study is whether the person actually recounting is even telling the actual truth, or actually putting you their version of the truth. There's sort of layers upon layers upon layers going on here. So I thought one way of getting around this, and literally hinted at this, was to observe them as well, to observe them in practice, which I did. And I have to say the institution was hugely cooperative with everything that I did here. So I observed quite a few lessons where these teachers taught, and as within a phenomenological study, I was guided to be very observant. And that actually had to be a trained thing for me, because I'm not very observant. I can literally walk into a room and notice virtually nothing. And one of the things that it was really set out for me in previous studies about the things I need to be looking for. Looking how the room is set up, looking how the chairs are set up, how tables, how people are interacting, how people are moving. And I captured all of this through the observation. And then as a final piece, I brought the teachers together for a final conversation where they were all together, and asked them to do a couple of things. One is to give them an opportunity to add anything that they thought they hadn't added. I asked some questions of things that I was interested as to why they hadn't mentioned them, and also to just give them a chance to have a shared experience. And by doing that, I felt and that I would at least have some level of triangulation of what was happening. There was the narrative, my interpretation of the narrative, there was a shared experience and observation, and hopefully that would come together to something interesting. So, what I did with all of that was I took it through thematic analysis. I was tempted to use a computer program. I'm an IT professional, sort of by profession. And one of the things that actually worried me about using a computer program, and again was indicated in the study, in the literature study that I did before I began, was programs themselves have biases. And it slightly worried me that I wouldn't understand these programs well enough. I'm not familiar with using programs for textual analysis and for thematic analysis. That might bias the findings. And I thought it much better that I engage with it and I really get deep into this and reread it and study it and do the thematic analysis by some old-fashioned methods with coloured pens and post-it notes and all sorts of other things. And another reason I was really glad with it, one thing I did sort of use a little cheat was I used voice to text to take because the transcriptions are really long. And I typed really slowly. And so I had this great software. Only problem all of the teachers had the Israeli accent, and oh my, what that software came out with was really quite incredible. So that actually reinforced my sense that actually it is better for me. It was a small enough amount of material to actually engage directly, and I'm really glad I did, because in reading and rereading and listening again and again and again to what had been said and what had been observed, I came up with this picture, and themes began to emerge, and that was really an interesting process. It wasn't actually a difficult process. They just emerged as things came together. And of all the conversations I had with the teachers, and as I said, they were all Israeli, all were women, all were proficient in English, and all were living and working in the UK. So there was a number of sort of similarities between them. There were other differences. And I will sort of just call this out. There were some distinct differences in the way that they engaged in the process. So one of them was incredibly warm and humorous in our conversations. One was quite guarded. So answered all the questions. We had a conversation. There was I had this sense of there's something, a wall. And one was, I suppose the only word I can describe is authentic, felt authentic. And what was really interesting was when I observed them, those played out as well. So when I observed the person who was warm and humorous, what I actually saw was a practice that was very different to the one that she described. The person who was very guarded, I saw a practice that was entirely different from the one that she described. And the person who I felt was authentic behaved in the classroom exactly as she told me. So that itself was just an interesting. It's a bit of an aside, and it did have some sort of influence on some of the findings perhaps. But it was very, very interesting that the teachers' personas and how they approached this whole process, how much of themselves they brought into this process, into the classroom, was also relevant. And I did sort of touch on this in the dissertation about questions of authenticity and being yourself in the classroom environment. But where it becomes more relevant, at least from my perspective, was in my own reflection on the study, and perhaps in some ways about how I'm bringing this here today. When I took these themes, three themes effectively came out of the study, and they're really interesting. And what I was expecting was there would be a lot of focus on the children, on the children's Jewish identity, on the children's Hebrew, perhaps their Zionist identity, their connection with Israel, something. No. Evolving Jewish identity, belonging, sense of self of the teachers was one of the things that came out really, really strongly from the study. Secondly was they had all of them a love of Ivrit, and it was expressed in terms of real love, pride, engagement, all superlatives, and that they wanted to pass that love of the language of Ivrit onto the children. And the third one, which I'll come back to why I think it's important, was a sense of caring and a loving responsibility for their students. Again, which perhaps wouldn't necessarily surprise in the sense, well, they're teachers, we kind of expect that, but I think it is quite relevant when we get on to some of the questions about how the teaching was actually done. So with the Jewish experience, there was a real intersection which I observed between the teacher's journey between the teacher's journey and their sense of self. And this was really, really powerful. And I'm going to play on this one in the sense that these were all Israeli secular Jews who had very little experience of Jewish community, in our sense of what we mean by Jewish community. And actually, by teaching within a Jewish community, they were going through a transformation experience. And in some of the conclusions that I draw at the end, one of the things that I suggest, and you can't draw this as a conclusion from such a small case study, but certainly from a research perspective, is that this might be something that we need to be looking at when we introduce teachers into Cheder or into Jewish education, think about their background, and do we train a teacher from Israel and a teacher growing up here in the same way? Are they experiencing different things? Or are a teacher born somewhere else? You know, something just to think about. The second one was this love of Ivrit. What was really telling was this was not a politicized Zionistic love of language. This wasn't what I expected, rah-rah sort of thing. No, it was a genuine cultural love of the language as part of their Jewish continuity. And that really astonished me, because I really wasn't expecting, again, going back to Gold's study, I was expecting this normalization of Hebrew. Yeah, it's just Hebrew, it's the language I speak. It's a bit like, us speaking English. No, that wasn't what I was seeing. Something quite different. Now, I don't know whether something has changed in Israel in the last 30 years, or whether those findings are just don't hold up to scrutiny. I don't know. And the third one, the sense of loving and caring responsibility, and I'll finish with this one. One of the things that troubled me, because of my bias towards teaching Hebrew in Hebrew, was that all of the teachers, without exception, think about this, these are Israeli, native Hebrew speakers, taught in English. Taught in English. And to the point that one of the things I actually observed was one of the teachers, actually when she was having a discussion with one of her colleagues about something, spoke in Hebrew. It reminds me of my parents. When they didn't want me to hear something, they said it in Yiddish. Yeah? And I still remember, and that's where I learned my Yiddish, because that's the time you listen. Okay? But it was giving this impression that actually Hebrew is something that the children can't access. It's inaccessible to the children. It's something other. And I was really, really troubled by this. And what I observed in some literature study after I completed the thematic analysis was that even educators who wish to teach in the native language, in other words, Hebrew in Hebrew, Japanese in Japanese, French in French, recognise that children often struggle. The children find that quite hard. It's quite challenging for the children. And if there is a strong sense of caring, of almost parenting, the instinctive response of the teacher is to make it easier for the child, to make it more comfortable for the child. But the outcome, and I'm not drawing a conclusion, but it was a sense, the outcome then might be that the children aren't challenged to engage with the true experiential piece of the language work. An interesting one. Many more. I believe I'm out of time, so I'll end there. Thank you.
Yes, the title is The Emerging Role of the Cantor Rabbi and Feminist Theology, Creating a New Leadership Paradigm in British Progressive Judaism. I also was not spare with my the title. My rabbinic dissertation is about changing paradigms of leadership. My own experience as an ordained Cantor... Lola. She has been a big part of this. She's been very good at getting out of her harness. Just let her. I worried that she would disturb the earlier speakers, but I'm not worried about her disturbing this one. My own experience as an ordained Cantor becoming a rabbi, the only one in this country so far, led me to explore the idea of rabbinic leadership and how the growing presence of Cantors in British progressive Judaism is positioned to change the way we think about leadership. My research led me to compare it to that other revolutionary change which we now quite rightly take for granted, the entry of women into the rabbinate and the transformative effect of feminist theology on the way we think about Judaism. So the dissertation began with an apparently simple question. In progressive Judaism, what's a rabbi for? Now, and also in the future. And my research led me to further questions. What's the new paradigm of rabbinic leadership that's beginning to emerge out of the tectonic shift occasioned by feminist theology? How do today's dramatic changes compare with the response of the early rabbis to the destruction of the temple as it led to the development of rabbinic Judaism and the role of the rabbi in that? And how does my unique position in the British progressive rabbinic world, an ordained Cantor seeking rabbinic ordination, offer me a useful view of the development of this emerging paradigm of rabbinic leadership? When I discussed my interest in this subject with my teachers and classmates, they noted that I have a personal stake in these developments, and in fact I am uniquely situated to explore them. It took a while for me to realize that. I remember Daniela turning to me and saying, "Well, come on, that's what you should be writing about," because I wasn't headed for that at all. In the powerful light of Jewish feminist values and ideas, the entry of the Cantor and the Cantor rabbi into British progressive Judaism is, I believe, not simply another one of the contributing elements that's changing the leadership paradigm, but rather the Cantor's role reflects and parallels that of women as rabbis, and it is usefully illuminated by aspects of feminist theology. It offers opportunities to take rabbinic leadership in a new direction. The United Kingdom is a unique place for this to happen because the fact that there is such a small number of Cantors here has led to the consequence that they've been accepted fully into the rabbinic community. This stands in contrast to the situation in the United States, where American Reform rabbis and Cantors have each had their own professional organizations for decades, about a century, or more than a century for the CCAR, and I think 60 years for the United Conference of Cantors. They're not going to merge. They've been separate for so long, there's little likelihood of that. And in fact, the Cantor, when I became a Cantor, I was not ordained, I was invested. I believe because the rabbis were jealous of the term. In 2014, I received a letter saying that my investiture was now considered an ordination. And so when I say I was ordained a Cantor in 1990, I wasn't. I was invested, but now we call it ordination. And so that shows the two separate paths that the two roles took there, and that's not the case here. The role of the Cantor barely existed in British progressive Judaism prior to 2009, when I first explored the possibility of working in the United Kingdom in 2010. I was told that progressive Judaism had gotten rid of the Cantor because the role was orthodox. But a year later, in 2011, when I moved to the United Kingdom and joined the rabbinic team of liberal Judaism at the Montague Center, there was a brief debate about my acceptance into the conference, and then I was accepted as a full member. And the name of Liberal Judaism's Rabbinic Conference has since been formally changed to the Conference of Liberal Rabbis and Cantors. At one point it was Liberal Rabbis and Cantor, but now there are two. And a similar change was made to the name of the British Reform Movement's rabbinic group, which is now the Assembly of Reform Rabbis and Cantors. Women in Judaism have long been the keepers of what Melissa Raphael calls the little tradition of hearth and home, Yiddishkeit, if you will, while men's role has been the creation and preservation of the great tradition of Jewish law in its formal context. Similarly, in contrast to what we might call the great tradition of the rabbi, the holders of theology and law, the Cantor is responsible for the little tradition, the music that, without changing the meaning of texts, the texts of the liturgy, opens those texts to reveal an emotional and spiritual depth which has little to do with theology or law and much to do with devotion to the beauty of the text. Now, I hasten to say, Cantors are not oppressed as women have been, even though we sometimes think so when we're arguing with the rabbi.
When they're arguing with us, you may know.
As it were, yeah. But their presence in progressive Jewish life reflects a focus on non-hierarchical relationships, a focus that's a central part of feminist theology. Feminist theology proposes a more egalitarian understanding of who we are, a rethinking of the role of authority, and how we define and encourage community, by focusing on relationships along with a creative engagement with tradition. Women's rabbinic ordination and feminist theology have transformed the role of the rabbi. Originally, the change centered on the mere, but revolutionary, presence of women as rabbis. And some of the writings about that from the 90s are hysterical. You know, the way women were seen at this shocking moment when a woman appears on the bima. And then subsequently on feminist theology, as well as feminist ethics and politics, and their focus on a relational rather than a hierarchical view of reality and other selves, a focus that encourages heterogeneity and pluralism. The history and role of the Cantorate as it develops in the United Kingdom fits into this paradigm as well. Originally it centered on the mere, but almost as revolutionary, presence of Cantors in British progressive Judaism, and then on the different stance towards Jewish life and worship that the Cantor brings, and also the different understanding of leadership that is a consequence of cantorial training and experience. Part of the remit of the rabbinic dissertation at Leo Baeck College is an engagement with rabbinic literature. And some of my interest in the question of rabbinic leadership arose out of my interest in the story of Eliezer ben Hyrcanus and his dispute with Rabbi Yehoshua and the sages, Baba Metzia 59b, the Avon Bachnai story, for those that would like to hear that. The tragic figure of Eliezer ben Hyrcanus and the dying world he represented has something in common with the transformation of the cantorial world of the American Reform movement in the mid to late 20th century, to which I myself was a witness and a participant, actually. I had concerns about the outcome of that transformation, and I regretted the losses that followed upon it. And I'm referring here to the movement from organ-accompanied, multi-voiced, and musically sophisticated music that was a principal feature of the music of the mid-20th century Reform Jewish congregation, to the guitar-accompanied folk and popular music-inspired repertoire that features more prominently in the contemporary progressive Jewish world. This change in the nature of the cantorate and Jewish liturgical music reflects, for better or for worse, the democratizing trends to be found elsewhere in contemporary progressive Judaism. So I'd like to give you a couple of examples of what that sounded like and why it was as shocking as it was to the ear. So first I'd like to do a couple of pieces that give you a sense of what you expected to hear in synagogue, certainly from the time I was listening to music in the synagogue in the 1950s through the 1980s or 90s. So let's see. Here is something from 1964. That was Richard Allen singing Ben Steinberg's Shalom Rav. Some of you may know it. This will just give you a sense of, this is from 1982.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop that one there. It won't offend the performer. That was me. And what happens when you're sitting in synagogue after listening to that, and then you hear this?
Miriam and the women took their timbrels in their hands, and they went dancing the whole night long.
I think you get the idea. I'm going to stop that now only because, just in the interest of time, they're all of them exciting, fun, interesting things to hear. But the musical language, the change in musical language was more shocking. I mean, you heard some of what it sounds like, but it's also something that you're now completely familiar with. So it doesn't have quite the same impact not nearly the same impact that it did then when people walked out of the room. And the guitar was seen as a kind of a real revolutionary instrument to bring into a synagogue. Of course, it's not anymore. And that was Debbie Friedman, and we now graduate from the Debbie Friedman School of Sacred Music, so a lot has changed. So that's just one view of some of the things that have gone into cantorial training and so forth. These questions led me about the role of the cantor led me to three principal areas. First, my own Jewish experience, as it's led me to cantorial ordination and now to rabbinic ordination. Secondly, an examination of the redefinition of rabbinic leadership in the early rabbinic world. And third, the development of the emerging leadership paradigms of today. So I argue that there's a similar, though less tragic, tectonic shift in Judaism occasioned by the rise of feminist theology, and I explore the ways in which leadership paradigms might also be influenced by the presence of cantors in British progressive Judaism, whether functioning as cantors as part of progressive Jewish leadership or as cantors becoming rabbis in my case. My approach was to interrogate my Jewish experience as a cantor and that of other cantors, to uncover the significant areas of cantorial training and experience and how they differ from rabbinic training and experience. And then I explored the shift in the shift in rabbinic leadership in the formative period of rabbinic development and the new understandings that feminist theology leads us to discover in the text as we explore it. And then I investigated the effect of feminist theology and the increasing number of women rabbis on the rabbinic role over recent decades. I explored the ways in which the unique role that a cantor in the United Kingdom may be an increasingly significant part of the emergence of that new paradigm for progressive rabbinic leadership. So the cantor's role is complex. The cantor carries the continuity and emotional ebb and flow of the service, and so is quite prominent in the eyes of congregants, but at the same time does not have the level of respect, authority, and awe, and of course the opposites of all these that rabbis experience, that rabbis are often given by their communities and by the larger community. Late 20th century initiatives, such as Synagogue 2000, it's now called Synagogue 3000, they've got some time now before they have to change that one, placed great value on music and invited cantors to participate, but they were not invited as authorities. Quite the contrary, in fact. The cantor's role was constantly vulnerable and constantly in flux. An essay in the influential CCAR, Central Conference of American Rabbis, annual in 1982, gives evidence of the quite different way rabbis were perceived in the 1980s. It's expressed in a letter written by a mother to a son who aspired to be a rabbi. You're going to love this. One of your hardest tasks will be to retain your humility. Rabbis receive so much adulation that they have to work. I know that they have to work to. I didn't write this. They have to work to hold on to a sense of perspective and keep themselves from believing all the nice things they hear people say about them. Cantors, in my experience, were and are seldom, if ever, the objects of such adulation. Nonetheless, the cantors were, I know what you're thinking, rabbis neither, but the fact that you could even imagine that about a rabbi, nobody would ever say that about a cantor. Not in my life. The cantor's role goes far beyond, however, the obvious one of leading the musical elements of the service. It can include education, administering and teaching a bar bat mitzvah program, pastoral visits, organizing and performing concerts, and officiating or co-officiating at life cycle events. American trained cantors, and I'm not an imperialist about this, it's just a very different educational experience to be a cantor trained in the US, even than in Europe where the German Geiger College trains cantors. It's just different there. They bring a unique perspective to the liturgy. Through exploration of liturgical music choices from their earliest days as students, cantors come to understand the liturgy intimately, while learning how different kinds of liturgical and paraliturgical repertoire complement the service's structure. Such choices and the underlying musical resources that frame them have been virtually unknown in the United Kingdom as far as I'm aware in my 8 years of involvement here. The British progressive Jewish musical tradition doesn't share with North America an interest in traditional cantorial cultures and traditions. It focuses rather on the organ and organ-based polyphonies in a style of late 19th century classical music. It often sounds a lot to me like Gilbert and Sullivan without the Gilbert. But the sense of the presence of the cantor is just not there. And that's so much of a piece of what American, and particularly Canadian actually, even more so there, progressive Judaism accepts and recognizes. Traditional Jewish prayer modes, part and parcel of the cantor's toolkit and expertise, are a central part of the fabric of the contemporary cantors. They carry both academic and musical depth, and the use of them reinforces the sense of an ancient source of the cantor's leading of prayers, as well as a guide towards the future of authentic progressive Jewish prayer. With the entry of cantors into leadership in British progressive Judaism, there is the possibility of an increasing awareness of the message that Jewish music carries, not just a familiar tune, but one that has cultural freight as well. Just as cantors are bringing a reimagined link to tradition into progressive Judaism, so have women been doing this since the end of the last century. Despite the diversity of their interests, the women rabbis of Great Britain today, this was written in 1993, are remarkably unified in their commitment. There is a commitment both to traditional Judaism and to a reforming of that tradition to include both the needs of women in the present and the experience of women in the past. As Melissa Raphael says, femaleness can be represented as a performative moral orientation and quality both specific to its cultural, religious, and ideological milieu, and as a universalizable, morally good will without which femaleness would cease to merit the term, but which may be equally attributable to men. And as Tamar Ross writes, I do not suggest that any given halakha would be decided differently by a woman, but it is probable that an active female presence in the halakhic discussion will at the very least encourage special focus on issues of concern to women and encourage greater attention to the variety of halakhic precedent and possibilities. So I would say that in addition to that, cantors are not simply another contributing element of the changing leadership paradigm. Their role reflects and parallels that of the role of women as rabbis, and their role is usefully illuminated by that feminist theology. Cantors have an anomalous role in synagogue life. Like the rabbi, they serve at the pleasure of the chair and council of the synagogue, but they are also generally presumed to be under the authority of the rabbi as well. They bring a special expertise into synagogue life, but one which is hard to identify specifically. The great tradition that we spoke of earlier is capacious enough to accommodate the more popular little one, and it is both produced by and produces it. This allows theology to include emotion and memory. So rabbis are making the great liturgical decisions, and cantors make the little choices that make the liturgy more beautiful and enable the congregant to engage with it in a way that goes beyond the bare meaning of the text. It seems to me that there is a parallel here with the traditional tasks of Jewish women. Again, as Melissa Raphael observes, the practicalities of Jewish women's religious lives allow those lives to infuse the practical with the transcendent. So too does the cantor's role in prayer bring a greater sense of the sacred to what can sometimes be the everydayness of prayers when they are merely read, by enriching the connection to the wider variety of Jewish music and by increasing the relationship of worshippers to the emotional dimension of prayer. Part of the training of the cantor includes elements of traditional worship, musical elements like the prayer modes, but also non-musical halachic elements, such as the instances in the liturgy where one stands or moves or faces the ark and so forth. Cantors carry this traditional awareness of the progressive to the progressive congregations they serve. And this can serve to connect the cantor to other streams of Judaism. The Toronto Council of Chazanim, for instance, is composed of cantors from the entire range of Jewish life, from black hats, literally black hats, all the way to somebody who's as left-leaning as I am liturgically and so forth. One of the very prominent Reform cantors at Holy Blossom Temple is also a widely respected traditional cantor. So all of these things combine in a way that transcend the denominational disputes that are present in rabbinic discourse. This can help a progressive community maintain contact across denominational boundaries, providing an opportunity for cross-communal contact and for an awareness that there are different ways of performing Jewish identity. Feminist theology transforms the role of the rabbi from text interpreter and decisor to facilitator and empowerer. This is equally true of the role of the cantor in progressive Jewish life. Cantors mediate between two cantorial worlds, one which embodies the basis of traditional cantorial identity, and one that focuses on the cantor's role in the contemporary Reform synagogue, as it were, going from prayer modes on the one hand to the guitar on the other. By juxtaposing these two worlds, sometimes uncomfortably, and in the process struggling with the contradictions inherent in inhabiting both at once, cantors help create a fabric of worship and Jewish life that allows congregants to make choices about what is most important to them, basing such choices on emotional commitment to Judaism as well as rational decisions. Yaroslav Pelikan has said, traditionalism is the dead faith of the living, tradition the living faith of the dead. It's a great quote. Both the role of the cantor and feminist theology can deepen and revive that faith. The cantor's role is grounded in the many traditions of Jewish music and has never been one of authority, but rather an artistic embodiment of the beauty of worship which is open to all. Feminist theology has revealed that patriarchal Judaism obscures the Jewish reality of half of all the Jews who ever lived. The rabbis and cantors' emerging leadership paradigm includes the enabling of that obscured half, and thus all Jews, to find themselves in Jewish texts and in Jewish life, thereby reinvigorating Torah, continually remaking it as a living truth. The parallel trajectories of feminist theology and the cantorial role together are working towards a new tradition, which is also a renewal of the old. Through life-affirming embodiment, relationality, ethicality, and the multivocality of the tradition, this is a restoration of tradition in its authentic and inclusive sense. And I'd like to play you one recording which expresses so much of the contradictions here. This is a piece that, a setting of the Hashkivenu, a little bow to our sleep discussion earlier, a setting of the Hashkivenu by Max Helfman, a wonderful composer of the last century in North America, sung by the son of a traditional cantor who became a progressive cantor and has since passed away, Bobby Bloch. Robert Bloch, one of the things that this music tells us is something about the evanescence of what cantors do as opposed to the semi-permanence, if you will, of what rabbis do. Rabbis write, and in their writing their work is preserved. It's not the same thing as hearing them and meeting them, but still there's something. Once the cantor is gone, the song is gone. And so I bring to you this wonderful, wonderful cantor whose, this is just an echo of what he brought to the text. That piece gives you a sense of what the synthesis of all these different pieces sounds like. That on the one hand, we have very clearly 19th century inspired composition, gorgeous writing with sophisticated harmonies, and then the cantorial tradition expressed in the places in between where he goes off on his own. It's written out music, but it sounds different every time somebody does it. And for those of you that are singers, no, you'll never sound like that. Thank you.